London, December 1971. The Smithfield Agricultural Show buzzes with farmers examining Western machinery until a red Soviet tractor stops them cold. The MTZ-50 Belarus sits gleaming in the pavilion with a price tag 35% less than a comparable John Deere. This was not just another product launch. This was the opening shot of an economic war, the economic weapon. The Soviet Union had weaponized agriculture, turning tractors into instruments of market conquest. The question hanging in the cold London air was not whether farmers would be tempted. It was whether free market companies could survive against a state-subsidized assault designed to destroy them. The stakes could not have been higher. This was Cold War economics in action, where the battleground had shifted from missiles to markets, from nuclear arsenals to dealer showrooms. The command economy operated on a logic that seemed unbeatable: produce in massive volumes, price below cost, win through sheer economic force. Soviet planners had studied Western markets and identified what they believed was capitalism's fatal weakness: the profit motive. Western companies needed margins to survive. Soviet factories did not. They had the backing of the entire state apparatus, unlimited subsidies, and a single directive: capture market share at any cost. The theory was elegant. If you could manufacture tractors for less than it cost Western competitors, if you had the resources of an entire nation behind you, if you did not care about quarterly earnings or shareholder returns, you could simply price everyone else out of existence. It was economic warfare without firing a shot. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. A typical Western tractor manufacturer operated on profit margins of 15 to 20%. They had to cover research and development, marketing costs, dealer networks, warranty programs, and shareholder dividends. Every tractor sold had to generate enough revenue to fund the entire ecosystem that supported it. The Soviets could ignore all of that. Their factories were state-owned. Their workers were paid regardless of sales. Their dealers were government-appointed distributors. They did not need profit. They needed penetration. The pricing strategy was surgical in its brutality. In North American markets, the MTZ-50 typically cost 15 to 20% less than Western alternatives. In the United Kingdom and some European markets, the savings reached 35%. Some dealers claimed even greater discounts in specific situations. These were not modest competitive advantages. These were numbers designed to make farmers reconsider everything they thought they knew about equipment purchases. Satra Trading Corporation, an American import and export firm serving as distributor, launched the most aggressive marketing campaign the farming world had ever seen. They flooded Western agricultural publications with advertisements showcasing the MTZ-50's impressive specifications: 55 horsepower, robust construction, and that impossible price point that made every farmer stop and calculate. The MTZ-50 looked the part. Built like the industrial machinery that had helped the Soviets win World War II, it projected strength and durability. The wide stance, heavy steel construction, and purposeful design spoke to farmers who valued substance over style. This was not some delicate Western machine that might struggle in tough conditions. This was a workhorse built for the harsh realities of agricultural life. But the machine's Soviet origins created an immediate obstacle that planners in Moscow had not anticipated. The ideological barrier was real, immediate, and visceral. Farm equipment dealers reported conversations that followed predictable patterns. A farmer would examine the specifications with genuine interest. He would calculate the savings on a scrap of paper. Then, his expression would harden, and he would walk away, muttering about communist tractors breaking through. For some American and Canadian farmers, the MTZ-50's Soviet origins created an immediate ideological barrier that no amount of discount could overcome. The Cold War was not just a geopolitical reality, it was personal. These were men who had fought in Korea or had sons serving in Vietnam. They had grown up with duck-and-cover drills and fallout shelter signs. They had watched newsreels of Soviet tanks rolling through Budapest and Prague. The idea of sending money to Moscow, of supporting the very system they had spent decades opposing, created a resistance that transcended economics. The reaction was visceral and immediate. Farmers would examine the MTZ-50 in dealer lots, walking around it with genuine interest. They would study the specifications posted on the windshield. They would calculate the savings on scraps of paper. Then, something would shift, a hardening of expression, a shake of the head, and they would walk away, muttering under their breath about communist tractors. The price might be right, but the principle was wrong. Yet the sales figures told a different story. Even in communities where political sentiment ran strongest against Soviet products, the Belarus tractors found buyers. Economic pressure has a way of eroding even the strongest convictions. Smaller operators struggling with thin margins and rising equipment costs found themselves reconsidering their principles. Family farms facing financial pressure could not afford the luxury of ideological purity when a Soviet tractor offered such compelling savings over its American equivalent. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. A struggling family farm operating on credit might face a choice between buying a Soviet tractor at $6,000 or a John Deere at $9,000. That $3,000 difference was not abstract. It was a year of mortgage payments. It was seed money for next season. It was the difference between expansion and survival. When you put it in those terms, ideology started to feel like a luxury reserved for people who were not facing bankruptcy. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Farmers who had initially dismissed Soviet equipment began asking dealers for hypothetical price comparisons. Just out of curiosity, they studied the specifications more carefully. They calculated potential savings. They slowly convinced themselves that purchasing decisions should be based on economics rather than politics. The internal rationalization followed predictable patterns. It is just a tractor. It is not like I am supporting communism. If it saves my farm, what choice do I have? The conversations at rural coffee shops revealed the shifting sentiment. Old-timers who had sworn never to buy anything, Soviet found themselves defending the purchase to their neighbors. The engine is actually pretty solid. The hydraulics seem strong enough. And you cannot argue with that price. Each justification was a small surrender, a quiet acknowledgement that economics had overwhelmed principle. Soviet trade representatives understood this dynamic perfectly. They positioned their pricing strategy not as communist propaganda, but as simple business sense. Why pay double for the same capabilities? The Cold War might rage in diplomatic circles, but in the fields, mathematics would ultimately prevail over ideology. They traveled to farming communities across Europe and North America. Armed with calculators and compelling mathematics, they showed farmers the numbers that seemed too good to be true. The pitch was consistent and effective. Look at your current equipment costs. Look at our price. Calculate the difference. That savings could mean new equipment, expanded acreage, or financial breathing room during a difficult season. The representatives did not talk about Soviet superiority or communist ideology. They talked about the bottom line. And for many farmers, that was a language they understood instinctively. This was not politics. This was farming. And farming was about making the numbers work. Salesmen quickly learned to navigate the treacherous terrain between economics and ideology. Reports from the time describe dealers who emphasized the tractor's technical specifications while carefully downplaying its communist origins. They talked about horsepower and hydraulic capacity. They discussed fuel efficiency and maintenance schedules. The red star on the hood went unmentioned unless directly questioned. When reluctant customers hesitated, dealers would counsel that it is better to trade than to shoot. The phrase became a common refrain in showrooms across North America and Europe. It was a way to acknowledge the Cold War while suggesting that commerce might be its own form of peaceful coexistence. By the mid-1970s, approximately 100 Soviet tractors were operating in Canada, with similar modest numbers appearing across Western markets. The figures were not overwhelming, but they were significant. Farmers who had never considered foreign machinery, who had been loyal John Deere or International Harvester customers for generations, found themselves placing orders for tractors from behind the Iron Curtain. The price advantage was simply too compelling to ignore. Each sale represented a small victory for economic pragmatism over ideological purity. Soviet planners watched these initial sales figures with growing confidence. They had cracked the code of capitalist markets. Everything came down to price. Offer the lowest number, win the sale. The complexities of Western agricultural economics seemed to dissolve in the face of simple arithmetic. The reports flowing back to Moscow confirmed their theory. Western farmers were rational economic actors. Present them with identical capabilities at a lower price, and they would buy. The ideological resistance was just noise. The market would overwhelm sentiment. But this confidence revealed a fundamental misunderstanding that would prove catastrophic. The Soviets had confused the initial transaction with the total value proposition. They had mastered the art of making a sale, but completely misunderstood what it meant to serve a market. They had won the showroom. They were about to lose the field. The infrastructure mirage. In the command economy, the relationship between producer and consumer ended at the point of purchase. Once the factory delivered the product, their responsibility was complete. The state would handle any problems that arose. Need a replacement part? Fill out the forms. Wait for the allocation. Work within the system. It was a model built on patience and acceptance, where downtime was inconvenient but not catastrophic. But Western markets operated on an entirely different principle. The sale was just the beginning of a long-term relationships between manufacturer, dealer, and farmer. This fundamental disconnect would soon transform the Soviet Union's greatest strength into its most devastating weakness. Within the first year of operation, these machines told a different story than the sales brochures had promised. Across Western farms, the MTZ-50 tractors that had seemed like such incredible bargains began revealing their true nature. Oil leaks were not occasional problems. They were constant companions. Hydraulic fluid pooled beneath every machine, creating environmental hazards and operational nightmares. The steering systems failed with alarming regularity. Farmers found themselves wrestling with tractors that would not turn, could not hold a straight line, or simply stopped responding to input altogether. The hydraulic pumps, which powered everything from the steering to the three-point hitch, were particularly prone to failure. When they went, the entire machine became useless. During the critical harvest window, when every hour of downtime meant lost income, these Soviet machines became expensive lawn ornaments. This was the accessibility paradox in its purest form. A tractor that cost substantially less but operated 0% of the time during harvest was not a bargain. It was a disaster. A farmer who saved $3,000 on purchase price but lost $10,000 in unharvested crops had not made a smart economic decision. He had made a catastrophic one. Western farmers discovered that the initial savings evaporated the moment something went wrong. And with Soviet tractors, something always went wrong. The machines were not engineered for reliability. They were engineered to meet production quotas. There is a profound difference between these two design philosophies. A tractor built for reliability is over-engineered at critical stress points, uses tested components, and incorporates redundancy. A tractor built to meet production quotas is engineered to minimum specifications, uses whatever parts are available, and assumes that maintenance will be someone else's problem. The real shock came when farmers tried to get their machines repaired. In the Soviet system, parts were allocated through central planning, distributed through state channels, and available when bureaucrats decided they should be. This worked fine within the command economy, where downtime was acceptable and efficiency was measured by production targets rather than profit margins. But Western agriculture operated on completely different principles. When a John Deere tractor broke down during harvest, the local dealer had parts in stock or could get them overnight. Service technicians understood the machines intimately because they had been trained by the manufacturer and supported ongoing relationships with farming customers. The dealer network was not just a distribution channel, it was a support infrastructure built over decades. Soviet tractors came with none of this. When an MTZ-50 needed a replacement hydraulic pump, farmers discovered they were dealing with a supply chain that stretched back to Minsk through Soviet bureaucracy and operated according to 5-year plans rather than harvest schedules. The wait times were measured in months, not hours. And even when parts finally arrived, they often did not fit correctly or were manufactured to such loose tolerances that they failed quickly. The contrast could not have been starker. Western manufacturers had spent decades building dealer networks, training service technicians, and creating parts distribution systems that could respond to farmer needs within hours. They understood that selling a tractor meant entering into a partnership that would last for decades. The relationship did not end when the farmer signed the check. It began. Soviet planners had completely missed this invisible infrastructure. They saw tractors as products to be manufactured and sold. Western companies understood tractors as platforms for ongoing relationships. The difference was not just philosophical, it was economic reality. Farmers who had been attracted by Soviet prices found themselves paying Western companies to fix their bargain tractors. Local mechanics familiar with Western hydraulic systems and electrical components could often jury-rig temporary solutions, but every repair required improvisation, every breakdown meant uncertainty, and every harvest season became a gamble. Would the machine hold together long enough to get the crop in? Or would it fail at the worst possible moment, stranding the farmer with a field full of ripe grain and no way to harvest it? The testimonials from farmers painted a consistent picture. The MTZ-50 might work adequately when everything functioned properly, but agricultural machinery does not operate in ideal conditions. It faces mud, dust, extreme temperatures, and the relentless demands of seasonal work. It gets pushed hard during critical windows when biological clocks matter more than mechanical sympathy. Western tractors were designed and supported with these realities in mind. They were built to absorb punishment, to keep running when conditions were terrible, and to be fixable quickly when they did break. Soviet tractors were engineered for different priorities entirely. Built to meet production quotas in state factories, they reflected the values of a command economy. Adequate performance under controlled conditions, with maintenance handled by state-employed mechanics using centrally allocated parts. The Great Reversal. The market delivered its verdict with ruthless efficiency. Farmers who had purchased Soviet tractors during the initial price-driven enthusiasm began trading them in for Western alternatives as soon as financially possible. The conversations at rural coffee shops and grain elevators told the story better than any sales report ever could. Have you tried to get parts for that Belarus? How long has it been sitting in your shed? Did you hear what happened to Jim's during wheat harvest? The stories spread like wildfire through farming communities. Jim's hydraulic pump had failed in the middle of August when his wheat was at peak ripeness. He called the dealer. They called the distributor. The distributor called Moscow. 6 weeks later, the part still had not arrived. Jim watched his entire crop deteriorate in the field while his Soviet tractor sat useless in the yard. His neighbors watched too, and they remembered. These were not abstract failures. They were economic disasters playing out in real time. A broken tractor during harvest was not an inconvenience. It was a financial catastrophe. Crops that sat unharvested lost value by the day. Weather could turn. Grain could mold. What should have been a profitable season became a loss. And the farmer was left staring at a machine that had seemed like such a bargain 6 months earlier. The resale values plummeted as word spread through farming communities about reliability problems and parts availability issues. A tractor that cost 35% less new might fetch 50% less on the used market just 2 years later. The depreciation was not just steep, it was catastrophic. Farmers who thought they had made smart financial decisions found themselves trapped with assets they could not sell and could not rely on. The used equipment market told the brutal truth. Dealers who took Belarus tractors in trade found them nearly impossible to move. They sat on the lot for months, while comparable John Deere and International harvester machines sold within weeks. Eventually, dealers stopped accepting them as trade-ins altogether. The tractors that were supposed to revolutionize agriculture became orphans that nobody wanted. Within a few years, Soviet agricultural exports to Western markets had substantially declined. The initial sales surge based on price advantage had reversed into a reputation disaster. Dealers stopped stocking Soviet parts. Why maintain inventory for machines that nobody wanted to service? The shelf space that had once displayed Belarus promotional materials went to competitors. The bright red brochures, with their impressive specifications, disappeared. The entire experiment in economic warfare through subsidized pricing had backfired spectacularly. The lesson was harsh, but clear. Markets do not just reward the lowest initial price. They reward total value over the entire life cycle of ownership. Reliability, service, parts availability, and ongoing support were not luxuries that farmers could sacrifice for upfront savings. They were essential components of agricultural productivity. A cheap tractor that does not work is infinitely more expensive than a reliable tractor that costs more. This was not theory. This was mathematics written in lost harvests and bankruptcy filings. Then came the statistics that exposed the complete failure of the Soviet strategy. The 1975 agricultural trade figures revealed one of the most stunning reversals in economic history. The Soviet Union, which had launched its tractor offensive with such confidence just 4 years earlier, found itself importing American agricultural machinery at an unprecedented scale. The numbers told a story that Soviet planners could not ignore. The United States sold $80 million worth of tractors and agricultural equipment to the Soviet Union in 1975. Soviet exports to American markets totaled $900,000. The trade imbalance was not just significant, it was a 90-to-1 ratio that exposed the complete failure of the command economy's market conquest strategy. Read those numbers again. 80 million sold to the Soviets, 900,000 sold by them. The nation that had planned to dominate Western agricultural markets was now dependent on Western machinery to feed its own people. The conqueror had become the customer. The predator had become the prey. This was not simply a matter of consumer preference. Soviet collective farms, operating under the same state planning system that had produced the MTZ-50, desperately needed reliable machinery to meet their production targets. The irony was inescapable. The same government that had tried to flood Western markets with subsidized tractors was now purchasing Western tractors to keep their own agricultural system functioning. The same planners who had dismissed Western dealer networks as capitalist inefficiency were now begging Western companies to service their farms. John Deere, International Harvester, and other American manufacturers found themselves in the surreal position of selling equipment to the very nation that had tried to destroy their market share. Soviet trade delegations, who had arrived in Western markets as conquerors, returned as customers, seeking the reliability and support systems they had failed to provide their own farmers. The meetings must have been more awkward. The Americans were too professional to gloat. But everyone in the room understood what had happened. The reversal revealed fundamental truths about how markets actually operate. The Soviet strategy had assumed that price was the only variable that mattered to customers. Lower the number enough, and victory was inevitable. But farmers, whether in Iowa or Ukraine, needed machinery that worked consistently, could be repaired quickly, and was supported by knowledgeable technicians. They needed more than a purchase. They needed a partnership, and partnerships cannot be commanded into existence by central planners sitting in Moscow. Why markets rejected socialism. Western manufacturers had not just built better tractors, they had built better systems. The dealer networks, parts distribution, training programs, and service relationships that Soviet planners had dismissed as capitalist inefficiencies turned out to be the decisive competitive advantages. These were not parasitic costs that inflated prices. They were essential infrastructure that created value. Consider what happened when a John Deere tractor broke down on a Tuesday morning in Iowa. The farmer called his local dealer. The dealer knew him by name, knew his farm, and knew his equipment history. The dealer either had the part in stock or could get it from a regional warehouse by afternoon. A trained technician arrived the next day, someone who had spent weeks at factory training facilities learning the machines inside and out. The tractor was running by Thursday. The farmer lost 2 days, not 2 months. This invisible network was the product of decades of investment. John Deere had spent years building relationships with local businessmen who became dealers. It trained mechanics who understood not just how to fix tractors, but how to keep farmers operational during critical windows. It created distribution systems that could move parts across continents in hours rather than weeks. This was not inefficiency. This was the entire reason Western tractors cost more. You were not just buying the machine, you were buying the ecosystem that kept it running. Soviet collective farm managers, facing the same productivity pressures as Western farmers, made the same rational choice. They bought equipment from companies that could keep their machines running. The fact that these companies happened to be located in capitalist countries was less important than their ability to deliver operational reliability. Ideology surrendered to necessity. The conversations in Soviet agricultural ministries must have been excruciating. Bureaucrats who had championed the tractor offensive as proof of socialist superiority now had to explain why they needed to import capitalist machinery. The reports going up the chain of command told a story nobody wanted to hear. Their own tractors did not work. The Western tractors did. They needed those tractors. The admission was more devastating than any military defeat. The great economic weapon had become a symbol of systemic failure. Instead of conquering Western markets, Soviet agricultural exports had demonstrated the superiority of market-driven innovation and customer service. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, forced to purchase the very products they had tried to replace. The MTZ-50's failure revealed a deeper truth about economic competition. Free markets did not win because they produced cheaper tractors. They won because they created systems of trust, reliability, and ongoing support that command economies could not replicate. Soviet planners could build machines, but they could not build the invisible networks of relationships that made those machines valuable to customers. This was not about superior manufacturing capability. Soviet factories could produce tractors at scale. The assembly lines worked. The metal got bent and the engines got bolted in. They could match Western production numbers when they needed to. It was not about inferior engineering talent. Soviet engineers had designed rockets that reached space and tanks that won wars. They understood physics, metallurgy, and mechanics. It was about the fundamental difference between a system designed to serve production quotas and a system designed to serve customers. In a command economy, success is measured by output. Did the factory meet its target? Did production increase over last year? The end user's experience is secondary to the statistical achievement. The factory manager who produced 10,000 tractors was a hero, regardless of whether those tractors actually worked in the field. In a market economy, success is measured by customer satisfaction. Does the product work? Can it be fixed quickly? Will the customer buy again? Will they recommend it to their neighbor? The factory that produces 10,000 tractors but cannot service them goes bankrupt. The market delivers immediate feedback. Build bad products, and you die. The discipline is brutal, but effective. These different definitions of success create different products. A tractor built to satisfy a production quota might technically function on the day it leaves the factory. A tractor built to satisfy a customer must reliably perform under demanding conditions, be supported by accessible service, and deliver value over years of use. The difference is not subtle. It is fundamental. The Soviet agricultural defeat revealed systemic weaknesses that would become increasingly evident throughout the command economy system. When central planning could not compete with market mechanisms in something as straightforward as tractor manufacturing, it signaled fundamental problems with the entire Soviet approach to international commerce. The pricing advantage that seemed so devastating in the showroom evaporated in the field. The subsidies that Moscow thought would buy market share instead bought resentment and distrust. The strategy that was supposed to expose capitalism's weakness instead exposed socialism's fundamental flaw. It could produce, but it could not serve. Western farmers learned a lesson that consumers across every industry would rediscover in different forms. The cheapest option is rarely the most economical. Total cost of ownership matters more than purchase price. The relationship matters more than the transaction. These principles seem obvious now, but they were learned at significant cost by farmers who took a chance on Soviet machinery. The verdict. For the Soviet Union, the agricultural machinery failure was more than a lost market opportunity. It was a preview of the systemic collapse that would come 15 years later. The same weaknesses that made Soviet tractors uncompetitive in Western markets made the entire Soviet economy uncompetitive in the global marketplace. The inability to create value beyond the initial sale, the failure to build service infrastructure, the disconnect between production and customer needs. These were not just problems with tractor exports. They were symptoms of a dying system. The pattern repeated across every industry where the Soviets tried to compete in Western markets. Consumer electronics that broke within months. Automobiles that rusted before their first oil change. Machine tools that could not hold tolerances. Every failure traced back to the same root cause. Production quotas do not care about the customer. Market competition does. This fundamental difference made central planning obsolete in a world where customers had choices. The $80 million import bill from 1975 was not just about tractors. It was about the failure of central planning to understand markets. It was about the bankruptcy of an ideology that believed production was the same as prosperity. It was about the eventual recognition that efficiency cannot be commanded into existence. It must be earned through competition and service. The numbers exposed an uncomfortable truth for Soviet planners. They could mobilize resources. They could build factories. They could manufacture products at scale, but they could not make those products work in the real world where performance mattered more than propaganda. The command economy excelled at building things. It failed completely at building things people actually wanted to use. Today, the MTZ-50 story serves as a case study in why markets work and why command economies do not. It is a reminder that price is not the same as value, that infrastructure matters more than ideology, that relationships outlast transactions. The Soviet tractor offensive of the 1970s failed not because capitalism was stronger, but because markets are better at delivering what customers actually need rather than what planners think they should want. Business schools study the Belarus failure as a textbook example of ignoring total cost of ownership. Economic historians point to it as evidence that subsidies cannot overcome fundamental structural problems. Engineers examine it as proof that reliability engineering matters more than manufacturing volume. Each discipline finds its own lesson in the wreckage. The tractors still exist. Some museums preserve them as artifacts of Cold War economics. A few farmers in remote areas might still use them, kept running through improvisation and determination. But they are relics of a failed experiment. Monuments to the hubris of believing that state power could overcome market reality. The lesson endures across industries and decades. You cannot subsidize your way to competitiveness if the product does not work. You cannot force customers to accept inferior value. You cannot replace trust with price. The invisible hand of the market delivered a verdict that no propaganda could overturn. No amount of ideological commitment could make a broken tractor harvest wheat. The Soviet Union sent tractors to conquer the West. Instead, they proved why central planning was destined to fail. The $80 million humiliation was not just a trade statistic. It was the sound of an empire learning that ideology cannot override economics, and that sometimes the most devastating defeats happen not on battlefields, but in farm fields where machines simply refuse to work. The Soviet strategy had assumed that Western capitalism's dependence on profit was a weakness. They discovered it was actually a strength, because profit requires satisfied customers, and satisfied customers require good products backed by good service. It is a simple equation that command economies could never solve. The math was brutal. The conclusion was inevitable. And the lesson remains relevant every time someone assumes that price alone determines value.